Hey guys, I'm TomBoss21, and today I'm going to teach you about the theory of betting volume. It surprises me that there's almost nothing about this subject online, even though it's one of the core metrics that drives poker strategy. Let's dive right in. Let me start with a brief mathematical introduction. So betting volume is just the sum of the bet sizes times the frequencies, right? And all this describes is the expected value of the amount of money someone is putting into the pot. How much money do we expect to go in? And so here's an example. This player is betting 6 big blinds, or 100% of the pot, 17.7% of the time, and 2 big blinds, or a third of the pot, 8.6% of the time. And so if we multiply bet sizes times the bet frequencies and add it all up, we get 1.234 big blinds. And this is the expected amount of money they're going to put into the pot at this specific node. So this is their betting volume at this point in the game tree. All right, simple enough, right? Let me make this more tangible for you. You open the small blind with king, queen of hearts, big blind calls, you're 200 big blinds effective with no rake, and you flop the absolute nuts, a royal flush, the best hand in poker. What do? Bet or check? Why? We'll circle back to that. First, let's take a look at the GTO solution. Here, we can see that it's mixing. 25% of the time it's betting, 40% of the time it's checking. But why is the solver mixing? And like, if you've looked at a lot of GTO solutions, this may be unsurprising to you. Yeah, so what, Tom? The solver mixes. Solvers frickin' love mixing. They mix everything. Why is this a thing? Why are we talking about this? Well, I want you to think about what that means. Because in my opinion, this is extremely profound. And if you haven't thought about why, I'm about to blow your mind. In practice, we want to make the most amount of money with our royal flush, and so you should just put it in whatever line makes the most amount of money, betting or checking. Now in GTO, what we can see is that betting and checking have precisely the same EV, 16.5. Now I say precisely, you can see there's a very small difference. That's due to noise in the solution. In fact, if it were solved perfectly, the EVs would be exactly the same. And that's just due to laws of game theory. What this means is that Big Blind donates precisely the same amount of money to the pot on average, regardless of what action we choose. And to me, this is deeply, deeply suspicious because what? You're telling me that regardless of whether or not we bet or check, on average, the Big Blind is going to put precisely the same amount of money into the pot? How is that even possible? How is they that balanced? It doesn't seem... Excuse me? Okay, let me throw a quiz your way. The starting pot on the flop is 6. Here's our expected value on the flop, 16.5. Now we have a royal flush, meaning we cannot lose. From this, is it possible to calculate Big Blind's betting volume? So how much money will Big Blind contribute to the pot on average from flop to river? Take a moment to consider your answer. The answer is 10.5 big blinds. Now, how do I know that? Well, the starting pot is 6. My expected value is 16.5. That has to come from the Big Blind putting money into the pot, right? And so, therefore, they must be putting in exactly 10.5 big blinds. Now, to me, this is kind of crazy because it means regardless of whether or not we bet or check, they're putting in precisely 10.5 big blinds on average. And that's freaking wild, right? And think about what else this means. Think about if you have the nuts in any other spot and the solver is mixing, that means the solver presumes that your opponent is precisely balancing their betting volume throughout the entire game tree, from all the way from that point on forwards. And this isn't just when you have a royal flush, like this is any time you have a good hand. Presumably, you would want to put your good hands in lines where your opponent puts more money into the pot, right? Like if you've got the nuts, put it into whatever line your opponent donates the most amount of money into the pot. That seems really obvious to me. But it's always mixing in GTO, which means that betting volume is one of the core things a GTO strategy tries to make indifferent in a lot of spots. Theory aside, all of this begs the question, is this realistic? Do actual people, do real players balance their betting volume this precisely? No, real people are wildly imbalanced because of course they are. Here, I've just gone and measured the betting volume of the Big Blind in a blind versus blind single raise pot. They're either facing a check in green or facing a bet in red. And here you can see in GTO, these two are almost equal, right? Because what this means is that facing a check or a bet, Big Blind is putting in almost the same amount of money. However, if we go and measure actual real people data, let's say on Ignition or Poker Stars, low stakes, mid stakes, 500 NL, you name it, that's not the case. What we see is that people put in way more money when the small blind bets rather than when they're facing a check. And that should come as no great surprise to you or really any decent player, because basic human nature is to be kind of stationy and not be aggressive enough, right? That's kind of the natural human way to play. Humans are a little too stationy. Humans aren't quite aggressive enough on average. And what this means is that people generally put more money into the pot when you bet as opposed to if you check. And so if you take nothing else away from this video, throw away the theory and all of that stuff, you should think to yourself, hey, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't slow play as much. Maybe I should just build the pot myself a little bit more. Some disclaimers, guys. This graph is a little bit misleading. If you want like a super accurate comparison, first of all, I should have filtered out all the range bet boards, because if we're range betting, then our opponent has no need to be balanced in their betting volume. And secondly, we need to be like, if I really wanted to do this properly, I should filter for spots where the GTO player is playing in such a way that they have a very strong hand, right? Like, so you wouldn't check fold the nuts. So I should just filter out all those spots, and that would get me a much fairer comparison of like the maximum amount of betting volume we could extract from our opponent. I haven't done any of that here, but I think even a surface level analysis reveals that generally speaking, people just put in more money when you bet compared to if you check on average, right? I also checked cutoff versus button single raise pots, and it's the same thing, right? And I'm sure someone could go down a deep rabbit hole and look into this more, but I think you guys get the idea. Next, I'm going to show you guys how action flow is actually a consequence of betting volume. So let's say you're playing a 6-max cash game, button opens 2.5, and you defend in the big blind with 6s, a pretty standard call here. The flop comes king, queen, 6, so we nail bottom set, and of course we check to the aggressor, setting the trap. But why do we check to the aggressor? Have you ever thought about that? Is it just because every poker pro you've ever heard said you should check to the aggressor and this is basic action flow, right? Or did someone tell you something more complicated along the lines of button has a range advantage, they have a better equity distribution, they've got more nutted hands, etc.? Like, think about this. Why should the player who's at an equity disadvantage check to the player that has an advantage? Well, we need to think about this from first principles. If we check, the button who has a stronger range should put in more money compared to if we bet. And so we can say button's betting volume is higher if we check and lower if we bet, right? That's how I would say it more precisely. And the easiest way to confirm that is just to take a look at the expected value of your set of 6s here. And so you can see 6s makes more money if you check compared to if you bet. So here, again, this is your expected value in big blinds. So you should obviously check because you want to make more money, right? But the same is true for every strong hand in our range. If we go compare EV and compare checking against betting and filter for the strong hands in our range, we can see that all of them either prefer or are indifferent. And so if all of your strong hands make more money checking compared to betting, well, that means all your strong hands should be checking, right? And the only way your strong hands make more money checking is under the assumption that the opponent puts more money in if we check. Simple enough, right? And so in a GTO solver, if all your strong hands are doing one thing, it means the rest of your hands must follow along, because a solver will not, for example, put all of its bluffs in one line and all of the strong hands in another line. That would be too exploitable and it would be punished on later streets, even if you force this street to be okay. And so since all of our strong hands are incentivized to check, that means that we should check everything. And we can also just run an AI solve and actually just test this. So let's create a new solution. And here it's going to reduce everything down to one size. But all I'm going to do now is just take away button's ability to bet. And so we're forcing them to check behind. How do you think our strategy changes in the big blind? Well, we've now lowered button's betting volume. So we've essentially made them put in less money when we check to them. And despite the fact that we are completely crushed on king, queen, 6, we should start donk betting. We should start building the pot ourselves, right? Crazy. And so you can very easily prove that action flow, the idea of checking to the previous street aggressor, is a simple consequence of betting volume. Okay, for the last example, we'll go back to blind versus blind. So we're playing 6 max cash, small blind opens, big blind defends, and I'm going to AI solve this because I want to be able to node lock it a little bit. So let me go ahead and create that solution, and we'll pick a fun flop like 5-5 deuce. The very first thing I'm going to do, save this. So click the little floppy disk or press M if you want to follow along. I'm just going to save this as my GTO baseline. This is a very handy feature to know about because I can just click this again and reload it. So anytime I'm like doing any type of exploration or coaching work, I like to save like a bunch of spots in here, and it's very easy to go back and check on that. Now, first thing we're going to do is a bit of a litmus test. We can see that all of our very strong hands are mixing betting and checking. So if we flop quads here, we're mixing bets and checks, and the expected value of these two is identical. The same is true for all of our strong hands. Ace-5 is mixing, aces is mixing, deuces is mixing, everything is mixing. And what this tells me is that the GTO solver here expects big blind to put in precisely the same amount of money, regardless of whether or not we choose to check or bet. So let's imbalance big blind a little bit, right? What happens if we check and we just force them to bomb into the pot? So what I'm going to do is just delete their ability to check back, and now they're betting everything. So how would you react as the small blind? Well, hopefully if you've been paying attention, you'll know that the answer is to simply check everything, right? Because now all of a sudden, you can make more money if you check compared to if you bet. A lot more money, actually, right? The same is true for ace-5. The same is true for quads. The same is true for all of your strong hands. In fact, every single hand in your range prefers checking over betting, even if it's a weekend. And the reason for that is because we expect big blind to put more money in when we check. Simple enough, right? Okay, well, let's take a look here. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the GTO baseline, and we'll try something a little bit sneakier, a little sneaky, okay? So what we're going to do is I'm going to raise this a little bit. So we're going to lock the folds in place. And I'm going to say, hey, you know what? When we bet, I need you to raise a little more often. Okay, so what do you do if you're the small blind here? You know that big blind is raising more. Presumably, that means you should just bet all your strong hands, right? Well, not so fast, because it's not quite that simple. The solver is very sneaky. You see, yes, big blind is putting in more money when we bet, so their betting volume has increased in this line, but it's compensated for that by putting in more money when we check. So if we check, they're going to bet more often, right? And we can see that if we check, they're betting a lot more often. And in fact, we can change this so it's the same size as it was before. We'll provide us with a cleaner comparison, if you will. And next, I'm just going to use this compare nodes feature to make this a little bit easier. We'll change that over here. Ooh, this one. Okay, so on the right-hand side here, we have the original GTO baseline solution. On the left-hand side here, we have the new solution. And what's new about the new solution? Well, I told it that when I c-bet, I want you to raise more, right? But that's not what we're looking at. What we're looking at here is what happens when we check. And you'll notice that in this spot, it's betting more often, right? So when small blind checks, the big blind is betting more often. To be clear, I didn't tell it to do this. Like, I didn't say, hey, you need to bet more often. It just did this to compensate for the fact that we increased the betting volume in the checking line, or in the betting line. So I increased the betting volume in this line. Therefore, it stabs more often when we check to it. And this is just kind of its way of trying to balance the betting volume in both the check and the bet lines, right? We're trying to make the betting volume the same in both of these lines in order to keep our nuts indifferent. And that's a super sneaky thing to do, right? Like, who here node locks like them to raise more and then thinks about, hey, maybe they'll adjust to my checking strategy in response to me making big blind raising more? No one thinks like that, right? But the solver thinks like that. And I think it just goes to show, like, how deeply embedded the concept of betting volume is to a GTO strategy, to any poker strategy, and how probably not deeply embedded it is to your average player strategy on PokerStars, right? Think about this. People don't talk about betting volume, right? I think it should be up there with the likes of like pot odds, MDF, like really like baseline, here's the first things about game theory you learn type of concepts. I think betting volume should be up there with those, but nobody talks about it, despite the fact that it's arguably one of the most important metrics to a GTO strategy, to any strategy, really, right? You use betting volume to make exploitative decisions. You use it to balance GTO decisions. It is hard-coded into the strategy of poker, but nobody freaking talks about it. Okay, if you skipped to the end of the video because you want the key takeaways, first of all, you missed a great video. Go back and watch the rest, you heathens. But if you just want the key takeaways, here they are. Betting volume, or BV, is just the expected contribution to the pot. So we can measure betting volume across an entire line, all the way to the river, or just at one specific node. But all it describes is how much money some player is expected to contribute to the pot on average. Generally speaking, as a matter of principle, you want to put your nuts into lines where they make the most money, and that's going to be lines where your opponent's betting volume is highest. In GTO, this will often be balanced, but in practice, not so much. Betting volume is ultimately responsible for action flow. The reason you check to the aggressor is because when you check, you expect the aggressor to put in more money if you check rather than if you bet, and therefore, you should check all your strong hands, and therefore the rest of your hands follow along, because if all your nuts want to check, then the rest of your hands must also check. If you increase betting volume in one node, the solver will generally try and compensate by increasing the betting volume in other nodes. Lastly, as a general takeaway, you will note that the population tends to put in less betting volume when checked to, and more betting volume when bet to. This is true in and out of position, and it's true through a variety of different stack depths and formats. Well, I think that this topic should be explored in a lot more detail in terms of exploitation, in terms of mass data analysis. All I did today was do a very surface level analysis of a very basic concept that I think is at the very heart of game theory. And I think betting volume should play a key role in the fundamentals of learning poker. But that's just my take. What do you think? Alright guys, that's my video. I really enjoyed making this one. I hope you guys liked it as much as I enjoyed making it. Feel free to shoot me a comment or hit up our Discord server with questions. And if you want to see more poker theory, check out this video next.